What is going on, you guys? I'm coming at you with another video, and today I want to showcase my Mekk-Knight Invoked deck profile. Now this is this is my newest deck I'm playing. I've been, not away from the game, but I just haven't made deck profiles consistently. That's just because I've been working on the decks I've been playing, going to locals, testing them out, and making sure I have the best deck profiles I can showcase possible. Now, what we're going to be going over today is the main deck, the extra deck, and the side deck. So you guys can already see there's some cheese in there, and it's actually really interesting, my opinions on that card. So stay tuned to the end of the video, and let's just get into the main deck. So starting off, since this is Mekk-Knight Invoked, you do want to play 3 Alistair, the Invoker, and the reason is he basically just searches you Invocation and gets your fusion plays going. Now for the Mekk-Knight portion of the deck, next we play 3 Mekk-Knight Purple Nightfall, and his effect is this: he basically targets a Mekk-Knight monster on the field, so you can most of the time just target himself, but it can be any Mekk-Knight. Targeting is cost, that's important to mention, and what it does is it banishes that Mekk-Knight until your next standby phase, and it lets you add a Mekk-Knight to hand. So what you can normally do is you can special this one, target himself. If your opponent has no response, banish Mekk-Knight Purple Nightfall and basically add any Mekk-Knight you need in this certain situation. What I find myself normally going for is when I banish Purple Nightfall, I most of the time do have other Mekk-Knights in hand, but what I do find myself searching is Mekk-Knight Indigo Eclipse, and the reason of that is because Indigo Eclipse, he has a quick effect, so it's during either player's turn, which he can move columns. So for example, if you special summon Purple Nightfall here, banish himself, you can add Indigo Eclipse to hand, and if you have more Mekk-Knights in hand, you can special summon Indigo Eclipse to where Purple Nightfall used to be, and then move them. And now the thing about Mekk-Knights is there has to be 2 cards in the column, meaning that 2 cards in like both players' columns. For example, if your opponent has a monster on the opposite side of this zone, you can just set a spell, and now since there are 2 cards in that column, you can special summon a Mekk-Knight to your monster zone. So that's really important to notice, that the Mekk-Knights are kind of designed for going second, and having the Invoked engine really helps the deck because you can summon a fusion monster in your extra monster zone, set a spell if your opponent doesn't have any cards in the column, and then basically special summon a Mekk-Knight where you now have space to. And so let's wrap it up more with the Mekk-Knights. Next, I only play 2 Blue Sky, and the reason I play 2 Blue Sky is because I found myself not really wanting to draw into him going second. I most of the time find myself more comfortable going into Purple Nightfall, and the reason of that is because he is the weakest, but he does have the biggest payoff. Now what Mekk-Knight Blue Sky does is, depending on how, so for example, again, there has to be 2 cards in that column, so once he's special summoned, you can add Mekk-Knight monsters up to the number of cards your opponent has on their side. So for example, if your opponent has 1 monster and 1 spell, you could add 2 Mekk-Knights with different names from your deck to your hand, and that's a really big payoff. But most of the time, I didn't really need them because when I drew into Purple Nightfall, I either had this in hand already, or I just didn't really need as many Mekk-Knights as I thought I would. So I basically cut them down to 2, which I used to play them at 3. And that's just my personal opinion. Most deck profiles do play 3, 3, and 2, but I find myself using 1 Red Moon, and for the reasoning behind that is, if there are 2 cards that you want to search, you most of the time will usually special summon this guy first and add either this guy or this guy, and this guy would either search you with this one or this one. So I just feel like 7 is the perfect ratio for me, and having Red Moon is just makes Blue Sky's effect much more light, because you can't add if you don't have the number of cards. For example, if your opponent has 2 cards and you only have 1 Mekk-Knight with different names in your deck, you can't really add them. So having these 2 is really good, and not just that, he's pretty big. Most of them are pretty big bodies, so that's just something important to notice. To finish with the monster lineup, we do play 2 Kaijus, and the reasoning behind that is because pretty much placement control. This deck does want to go second, always wants to go second, so you Kaiju one of your opponent's monsters and you place it in the column you want to place it. Therefore you're controlling the columns, and you can special some of your Mekk-Knights accordingly to how you want to. So just 2 Kaijus is, my personal opinion, just fine. You don't really always need them, but being able to control where your columns are and where you can special some of your Mekk-Knights is really important in this deck, and it's really fun to do. Next we play 3 Effect Veiler, because I feel Ghost Ogre really fell out of relevancy in this meta. And going second, you don't really mind drawing 2 Effect Veiler because they're not once per turn. Unfortunately, it is during the main phase, but that's kind of when plays are going. So drawing into 2 Effect Veilers isn't too bad. And the Invoked engine allows you to use your graveyard to fusion summon. So Effect Veiler's Makaba. And finally, for the other hand traps, we play triple Ash Blossom because Ash Blossom stops nearly every single deck. Or there's at least every single deck has a search card or a draw card, and Ash Blossom just stops that. It is once per turn, so not like effect better. Not saying it's better, but yeah. That pretty much wraps it up for the monster lineup. Let's talk a little bit about the spells. So for the spells, we play 2 Pot of Desires, and the reason behind that is you can most of the time just like set your Pot of Desires, special summon your Mekk-Knights, and then you're able to get your draw card. The thing I always recommend with Pot of Desires and decks like these that search heavily, like in the Invoked archetype, the Invoked like Alistair searching, is you always want to try to get your Alistair search first, because I always have that problem where I banish things I necessarily need, but Pot of Desires, in my personal opinion, is such a high risk, high reward card. It can technically unbrick you. It adds 2 new cards to your hand, so I think it's very much worth running. But then again, that's just down to personal personal player preference. But Pot of Desires is a very good card in this deck because getting more cards in your hand, getting more Mekk-Knights just continues your plays. Next, you play 3 Terraforming because you want to search 3 Magical Meltdown. And what Magical Meltdown does, it just lets you add Alistair. So basically, drawing Terraforming, drawing Magical Meltdown is basically like Alistair. So for example, you play 9 Alistairs. This gets you to Alistair. This gets you to Alistair. So Alistair, the deck kind of revolves around Alistair's fusion summoning, but the Mekk-Knights are what brings the deck's like powerhouse home. Like the Mekk-Knights just add like more firepower to the deck. Next, we do only play 2 Invocation. I don't really like playing 3 because you don't really want to see this card. You want to add this card from Alistair's effect. But again, some players just play 3 to not get ashed. But in my personal opinion, 2 is fine. You only really need 2. You actually really only ever need 1. So if you banish 1 off Pot of Desires, you're good because it recycles itself. When you banish an Alistair, when an Alistair is banished and an Invocation in the graveyard, Invocation's second effect allows you to shuffle Invocation back into the deck and shuffle Alistair back into your hand. Will add Alistair back into your hand, but Invocation is just perfectly fine at 2, in my personal opinion. Next, we play the newest card, which is World Legacy's Memory. And what this card is, it allows you to special summon a Mekk-Knight from your deck in defense position. The only downside to this card that I see is that you can't special summon any other monsters except Mekk-Knights for the turn after you activate this card. So for example, you can still go into your Invoked plays and then activate this after you went into your Invoked plays, and then continue your Mekk-Knight plays from there. What I usually recommend doing is using this to summon Purple Nightfall. Purple Nightfall, target himself, banish, and then special summon more Mekk-Knights that way. Purple Nightfall will come during your next standby phase. So that's pretty good. The only thing also is that during game phase, that Mekk-Knight will leave due to World Legacy's Memory's effect. So that's why I usually go into Purple Nightfall, banish. So he'll come back during your next standby phase, and he won't need to leave at the end phase. Next, we play 3 Mind Control, and this card is super awesome because it just takes an opponent's monster and you can just link it away. It targets, unfortunately, so monsters, that can be targeted, but normal summoning Alistair, mind controlling, taking a monster, and basically just linking those 2 away for a link 2, so it allows you to just take opponent's monster. Again, it isn't once per turn. This card is absolutely ridiculous, so it's obvious for me. It's a must at 3, and I just think linking away an opponent's monster that they like heavily need is just awesome. Most of the time I find myself going into Underclock Taker and just making a big Invoke monster and just start beating down from there. My favorite play is always Underclock Taker and a boss monster and having Purgatrio, because anyone who plays Invoke knows how busted Purgatrio is. Purgatrio is game pretty much all the time. But next, we play 3 Called by the Grave, and the reason behind that is you don't want to get ashed on Invocation. That's basically it. You don't want to get ashed on your Pot of Desires and basically neg 10. So, well, neg 11 because card in hand. But that's not far from the point. You just always want to have Invocation in hand. You want to always let your searches resolve. So 3 Called by the Grave, in my personal opinion, is a must. And not just that, it's actually a really good card to use defensively. You're able to snipe cards from the graveyard. It's just a great card. And finally, we play 3 Win Conditions, which is 3 Scapegoats, or as my buddy likes to call it. Again, his win condition. Mekk-Knights don't really the Mekk-Knight Invoke deck doesn't really suffer from spamming the board too heavily. Most of the time you're gonna have a Makaba and maybe 1 or 2 Mekk-Knights if they get destroyed in the main phase. Again, Purple Nightfall's effect really helps where you get to banish himself, so you're always gonna have space for Scapegoat. And again, it's just a win condition. It's a 1 card Borreload. It's a 1 card Topologic Bomber Dragon. It's a 1 card almost any Link monster you can think of. And that pretty much wraps it up for the monster and spell lineup. I want to talk a little bit about the extra deck and a little bit about the side deck, and my philosophies behind the side deck and how I play it, how I recommend you guys should play it. when they force you to go first. So let's talk a little bit about that extra deck. So for the extra deck, it is pretty standard. I don't really feel I need to explain too much about the extra deck. So I always recommend having tokens, because cards that generate tokens and placement is really important in Yu-Gi-Oh! So I always recommend having tokens. I really am against people who use die to represent their tokens. So please, people, always have your tokens. It always helps visual players such as myself remember where things are. So it's always good. Next, we play one Link Spider and one Link Karibo. The reasoning behind that is because Scapegoat, Link Karibo can distribute a level 1. Like, you can tribute a Scapegoat even if you have it in the grave. Most of the time, you just go into these two to get your 1 card Borreload. And 1 Underclock Tigger, because mind controlling a monster and Alistair equals this. And you're always going second, so it's just cool to... He points down also, so it allows you to go into some Invoke plays. Unlike the Nightmares, which we do play 1 Unicorn, 1 Cerberus, and 1 Phoenix. All of them have the effect where they discard a card once. Like, if you can choose to discard a card when they're linked summon, you can choose to discard a card, and they each have an effect. Shuffles 1 into the deck, targets a monster in the main zone, destroys it, a special monster in the main zone, and pretty much back row. My personal favorites always go into is always Nightmare Phoenix, because again, I snipe the back row, then I just go into Macabre, and most of the time kill for game. Unicorn is one of the ones I kind of don't really go as much into. It's either always Cerberus or Phoenix, and what you could sometimes do is use the 4 tokens to make these two, and they pretty much protect each other. So 19 and 1600, and they like when they're pointing to each other like that, they can be destroyed by battle or card effect. So that's pretty good for, you know, one Scapegoat being able to get these two in the indestructible wall, and you will still have your like invoked monster in the top zone. Next, 1 Borreload Dragon, because like Link Scapegoat equals Borreload, and Borreload most of the time takes Borreloads, it equals for game. So that, yeah, it's pretty. The Scapegoat's pretty busted, and Borreload's pretty good. 1 Mekk-Knight Spectrum Supreme is because the deck needs boss monster. He could attack directly if he's the only card in the column. If he points to nothing, he's basically Masterpiece, as where he can't be destroyed by card effects and he can't be targeted by card effects. Plus, if like he's the only card in the column, again, he can like attack directly, so that's pretty busted. For a Link 3, having 3K, being a 3K beater is really good. So I just recommend always having him at 1. He does come up at some points, because with the new Mekk-Knight, like War Legacy memory, you do kind of spam Mekk-Knights now. So I always recommend running him on, and he's pretty busted. Invoke Kaliga. I play pretty much all the Invoke monsters at 1. And Macabre at 2, because it is a light deck, and you really only ever need 2 Macabres. I've only found myself using the third, like needing a third Macabre once or twice, but you kind of always want to have at least 1 of each, because you know it just makes your invocation that much more worth it. The ones you mainly only go into is Macabre and Purgatrio, because how heavily Ash Blossom is being used. I do find myself using Raijin a little bit more, because Drone Lockbird is becoming more like heavy into the main deck. That's pretty much it, but they're always good to have, and I'm just going to explain it. Whatever you discard, you basically negate and banish. So if your opponent activates a spell, you can discard a spell using Macabre's effect to negate and banish it. Magellanic is a vanilla 3K like Invoke monster. He's pretty beefy. Invoke Raijin could attack all monsters once each, and he gains 200 for each card your opponent controls, and he does piercing damage. He has 3 effects. He's absolutely busted. Invoke Cocytus could attack and defense, and he basically can be targeted or destroyed by card effects. Raijin's a Book of Moon on legs, and Invoke Kaliga kind of like a skill drain, and only one monster could attack during like 1 of each. So each player can only attack with 1 monster at a time. So Kaliga is pretty busted, and this pretty much wraps it up for the 15 card extra deck. Now let me talk a little bit about the side deck. So the side deck kind of fits into my personal philosophy on playing most decks that go second, and your opponent's like perceptions of how decks that go second play. So for example, for the Ultra Cheese, honestly, I don't know why people aren't running Firecracker. It steals games and extra, and like in the extra, like in the new time zone. And I've won like several games playing Firecracker, and it's just a funny card. And what Firecracker does is he's a during either player's turn where you could discard him and inflict 1,000 damage to your opponent. So if your opponent goes first, he's trying to stall for time. You play enough draw cards to where you can technically get into him, and you know you're mainly going second. So that 6 card could be Firecracker, and just what he basically does is he burns your opponent for 1,000. So once your opponent does all their plays, if they're still in their main phase, they can't do enough damage. You just Firecracker them for game. And that's pretty much the cheese of the extra deck. It's actually really good. I highly recommend running it in the extra deck, in the side deck. I mean, I highly recommend running it in the side deck, Next we play 3 drone Lockbird because uh, Sky Striker's Trickstar is a thing. So you know you kind of just want to stop them, and I don't really want to main it because it doesn't hurt enough decks. You know, you kind of always want to side into it. 3 Twin Twisters for back row decks like Altergeist and things that they really give this deck problems, being able to like bounce back that normal summon. Shared Ride again for like, there's so many decks that are really spell heavy. You know, you'll like, and search heavy. So again, for Sky Striker Trickstar, which is in my personal opinion the best deck of the format, and for Goki because they do search a lot. So that, and then finally we play 1 Imperial Order and 2 Anti-Spell. My reasoning behind that is you don't want to play 3 Anti-Spell Fragrance because if you get to the Imperial Order, you have the Mekk-Knights to where you can just special summon them in body. And my reasoning behind these certain cards are, when you win game 1 or game 2 and your opponent sees you're playing a go second deck, they're gonna be urged to make you go first. So what I personally do is I still go first. The only thing is I side in these 9 cards, and I take out the Kaijus and the Mekk-Knights, which is a total of 7. So that's a total of 9. So I'm able to side in going first cards like Drone Lockbird, Anti-Spell Fragrance, and Imperial Order, and like maybe Twin Twister if I'm playing a back row heavy deck. So that just completely mind f's my opponent, because now I made my going second deck a going first like stun build. Shared Ride, sometimes your opponents are just so reluctant to add cards during their turn because you're basically going to be plussing as much as them. So Shared Ride, like these 6 cards appear an automatic turn ender, and Drone Lockbird can also be an automatic turn ender if they don't have the Call by the Grave. But that's just pretty much my philosophy. What I always recommend playing a go second deck is side out all the going second cards and side in all the going first cards, all the going first floodgates, because if you special summon all your Mekk-Knights and you can bring out an Invoke monster and then you just flip Imperial Order during your opponent's turn, that's pretty much game over because you have the big beaters on the field, and at this point you don't really need to use spell. Like once Macabre on the field and you have Mekk-Knights, you don't really need to like special summon as much. But that pretty much wraps it up for the extra deck. Now let me get into some final thoughts. So that pretty much wraps it up for the video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you guys learned something about Mekk-Knight Invoked. I hope I was able to convince you that this is a pretty decent deck, and I hope even if you're not even planning to play this deck, I hope you learned something about how to play against. If there's anything I missed, feel free to comment that in the comment section below. I love reading comments. Are there any cards you recommend? Are you personally a Mekk-Knight Invoked player? I'd love to hear your opinions on my deck profile. But that pretty much wraps it up for the video. Thank you guys for watching. I'll catch you guys in the next one. My name is Hezma, and I'm out.